Well, good morning. I'm not sure if it is recording, so I'm going to hit record here. Good morning. This morning we're going to be looking at the second half of our lesson of Jesus being the fulfillment of the Exodus. And specifically, we're going to look at how Jesus is like the prophet to Moses. Sorry about that. Here we go. And I'm gonna make a bold claim this morning. It's not too bold, but it might be bold to some people. I'm gonna say that Matthew wrote his gospel to a very Jewish audience, and he structured it in a way that they would have instantly recognized because their brains weren't melted by the internet and Twitter and Facebook, because they didn't have those things. And so what they did in their lives was they talked about things that were relevant to them, and that included the scriptures. And so they saw Matthew, as he presents his gospel, especially as he presents his genealogy, kind of a famous sort of event. I went over this last time because last Sunday we went over the genealogy that Matthew gives of Christ. And we noticed that it is intentionally incomplete. It does not match Luke's genealogy. It does not match anybody else's genealogy. It doesn't match the genealogy in the Old Testament. And we said that the reason for that was because of the symbolic nature of how he was trying to present that genealogy. He left names out specifically to show that the reader who was reading this would have put himself in the seventh group of names. There's 6 groups of names given. Jesus is the last name given, so it fills up that 6th group. And so the reader then would say, oh, well, this is my day now. I'm in the 7th group. And so Matthew structures his gospel for a Jewish audience specifically. And it was to prove that Jesus was Israel's Messiah. And so Matthew's primary focus is Jesus' identity, and his gospel here serves several purposes to show and to prove Jesus' identity, especially in the first 4 or 5 chapters here of Matthew. And so we saw, or we're going to talk about next week, that Jesus is Emmanuel. He is God with us, and this is, we would never have known that this was a prophecy relating to Christ if Matthew hadn't told us, because that's not how the people of that day viewed it. It's not how the people of Isaiah's day viewed it when they heard this prophecy, but we'll get to that next Sunday. But Matthew is trying to show us that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the long-awaited king/priest of God's people. And so Matthew speaks of Jesus as proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom of heaven. And so the Beatitudes then in Matthew chapter 5 and going on the Sermon on the Mount, they're all framed in kingdom language. Right? They're framed of kingdom of heaven statements. In the kingdom of heaven is like this. And that wording occurs 8 times there in chapter 5, or during the sermon anyway. And so the Sermon on the Mount then is the speech of a king. He is the word of God, John tells us in John 1:1. It is the word of God going out to the people, like Moses did. And we looked at that last Sunday, the Sermon on the Mount, and how Jesus is this archetypal fulfillment of what the perfect lawgiver is. And so the last couple points here of Jesus as Moses and Jesus as the Messiah are going to be the focus of today's lesson. And specifically, we're going to look at a couple things that we didn't look at last week. We're going to look at the birth and the infancy story. We talked about this in the Bible class a little bit. And this is really the second example that Matthew uses, the first example being the genealogy, right? I mean, as you read through chapter 1, you come to the genealogy first. But now we're getting into the birth and the infancy narrative, and some of the aspects of the story are very obvious, and some are not. So there's clear resemblance, right, between what Herod did in his attempt to kill Jesus and the story of the Hebrew nation infant boys that were tried to be killed by Pharaoh, right? And so Pharaoh is watching Israel grow and be blessed, and how their herds are multiplying, and how their own herds then exceed even Egypt's. And so Pharaoh says, we need some ethnic cleansing. We need some genocide here. We need to kill off these people. And so he starts out by killing the male sons. Well, that parallel between Christ and Moses is explicitly telegraphed there in that idea of Herod killing children. There's a second one here talking about the birth and infancy of when Jesus is young. In Matthew chapter 2, in verse 15, let me just read it real quick. It says, verse 14, and he arose and took the child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I have called my son. Matthew is quoting Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. Out of Egypt I have called my son. And because the angel tells Jesus and his parents, Jesus, an infant at this point, or a child, to go to Egypt, and then the angel, when it's okay, says that they can come back. And so it's a direct linkage of what's going on by analogy to what's going on in the Exodus, right? Israel in Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1, the passage here that Matthew is quoting, what is Israel doing at this point? Israel is the son of God, right? Hosea is a prophet to them. Israel was called the son of God in, where are they first called the son of God? Exodus. That's where they're first called the son of God. Exodus 4 and 23. And so this is the whole point here, that the son of God is being called out of Israel to deliverance. In this case, he's going to be the deliverer. And again, in verse 20 of chapter 2, it says, arise and take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who have sought the life of the child are dead. So again, Matthew is quoting Exodus chapter 4 again, but this time he directly substitutes Herod for Pharaoh. And this is only really apparent if you study the original language, because if you look at the original Greek that Matthew uses here, it's the same Greek that's used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. So he's quoting Exodus again, even though many Bibles don't necessarily have it as a quote. He's quoting Exodus again, and he's substituting Pharaoh's name for Herod. And so Jews of the day would have picked up on this immediately. Oh, I read that before. I read it over here. But it's not so apparent in English. So it's good for us to study these things and to find out the context of what Matthew was saying these things in, because the context is that the reader of this was supposed to be anticipating a new Exodus. This new leader that's coming out of Egypt. Moses came out of Egypt. He led the people out of Egypt. I'm supposed to be thinking in terms of the Exodus here. And so we're left anticipating the rise of this new deliverer, and we're left anticipating Israel being led out of exile. Remember, when Babylonian exile ended, who came back? Judah and maybe Dan or the Levites, it depends on how you count it. All the tribes didn't come back. They were still expecting to come back from exile at the point in Jesus' day. Oftentimes we think, oh, well, exile's over, the king built a new temple, it's all good. Well, that's not what happened. All tribes didn't come back. Isaiah specifically prophesies that all the tribes would come back. Ezekiel specifically prophesies that all the tribes would be woven back into one. The two sticks would be made into one, and then they would be gathered together. That hasn't happened in the first century until Christ comes. And so they're left anticipating, after reading Matthew's gospel here, if you were a Jew of that day, you would be left anticipating this new exile, this new leader who's going to lead the exiles either out of Egypt or out of Babylon. So the second one I'll look at this morning, it's the third one overall. So we had the genealogy, the birth and infancy story. Now we get the baptism of Jesus. And we hit this a little bit in the lesson this morning in the class, but Jesus' role as the fulfillment of the Exodus and the new Moses being Deuteronomy chapter 18, right? When he says a prophet like me is going to come. This happens at the point of the baptism of Jesus. So the presentation, as we look at how it's presented to us here in Matthew's gospel in chapter 3, the presentation of this for us uses Exodus imagery. It's the passing through the water, and it uses through the water, right? Israel goes through the water and becomes a new nation to show that they're delivered. There's a new birth going on idea there. And so they got to pass through the water to get where God is. God's at Sinai, so that they can receive the covenant. And in Jesus' case, when he gets baptized, this is a very public event, right? It's not hidden in a corner. John the Baptist often had crowds around him because he was charismatic, apparently. And so this was done in front of everybody. This was not a secret. It's a public declaration that Herod's plot to kill Jesus failed. That's what it is. And so Joseph is a carpenter, right? He's a nobody. He's living in obscurity. And so when Jesus is baptized, the way Matthew presents what's going on here, it's like, oh, okay, Herod tried to kill Moses, and now we've got the same situation going on here. Jesus is the new Moses. That's what's going on here. And so Jesus comes out of obscurity, and the plot to kill him had failed. And here he is, after years of not knowing where he is, because remember, Herod was trying to kill this new king of the Jews. What else happens that is related to this, where they go away for a while and then comes back to lead the people? Well, Moses, when he escapes to Horeb, right, which is the region that Sinai is in, after he kills the Egyptian, he escapes to Horeb for 40 years. And so Matthew is using this imagery, and so in this case, when Jesus gets baptized, this is a public event to show that the new Moses has arrived and is ready to lead his people out of captivity. That's not going to be too enjoyable for the leadership because they are the ones holding them captive. But that's another story. Temptation in the wilderness is the next one, the fourth one in the series here. And so you have the temptation in the wilderness here. And this is moving along to Matthew chapter 4 now. And in chapter 4 here, the Son of God is sent out into the wilderness to be tested after his baptism. And that's exactly what happened in the Exodus story. Jesus is faced with 3 separate temptations, right? Each of those challenges, in some way, challenges the nature of his sonship and his mission. So Israel is the son of God, and their mission is to bring the word of God to the nations to be a priest to all nations, right? Genesis chapter 12, 15 and 17, when God makes those promises to Abraham. And so Israel is called God's son. Remember Exodus chapter 4? Israel went out. Israel passed through the sea and out into the wilderness. And just like after the baptism, Jesus passes through the water and goes out into the wilderness. And even before Sinai, right, people were tempted by hunger. Even before Sinai, and they're failing 3 days after Sinai. And so think about the story of Israel on their way to Sinai. Right? Exodus chapter 16, they complain that they don't have enough to eat, right? Or they complain about what they have to eat. And so they're tempted by hunger. Jesus, like Israel, is tempted by hunger. Jesus, like Israel, is in the desert for a period of time, marked by the number 40, right? Israel's in the desert for 40 years. Jesus is in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights. Moses, when he goes to Horeb, is in the desert for 40 years. Jesus is tempted with hunger, but unlike Israel, he decisively clings to God's word for his own sustenance, right? And so Israel is tempted to test God. This is the second one. So we have food. We got temptation linked to testing God. Israel is also tempted to test God in Exodus chapter 17. And this is the first water from the rock episode that I mentioned during the class. This is Meribah, the waters of Meribah, and God commands Moses, and he strikes a rock, and water comes out. And so Jesus is tempted to test God when Satan says, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. But unlike Israel, the first Son of God, Jesus, the ultimate Son of God, or the last Son, or the last Adam, like Paul puts in Romans, chooses to trust and obey God and not test God. So we have temptation linked to hunger, temptation linked to testing God, and then the last ones here is temptation linked to bowing down to another God. Right? At Sinai, Israel is tempted by idolatry. To quote Aaron, we threw all our gold in there and out came a calf. That's what he said, if you believe that. And so, if these points sound familiar so far, the temptation linked to hunger, testing God, and linked to bowing down to another God, it's supposed to sound familiar. Jesus is tempted to commit idolatry to worship Satan. Just like Israel is tempted and chooses to serve and worship the golden calf, Jesus chooses to serve and worship God and not Satan. And so God's firstborn son, Israel, fails in the wilderness, and Jesus, the son par excellence, right, emerges from the wilderness victorious in obedience to God. And so Matthew is careful to parallel Jesus' wilderness experiences with Israel's wilderness experiences. It's the way he shapes his gospel to tell us about these things. And the fact that Jesus cites Deuteronomy in all three temptations is very important here in the storyline of how God is presenting these things to us. Right? This is Mosaic stuff. Jesus is the new Moses, the new prophet that is promised in Deuteronomy 18. And so the new prophet might be like the old prophet said he would be. And so it's exactly at this point that the Son of God and the servant themes from Isaiah intersect. And I'm not the only one to see that. Matthew obviously saw that too, because he says that Jesus is this Emmanuel. Emmanuel, God with us. This person in Isaiah, because he quotes that from Isaiah 7, that's in the understandable part of Isaiah, I like to say. It's not down in the craziness that goes on much later in the chapter. But the idea is that there's servant songs in Isaiah, if you don't know about it. There's certain songs in Isaiah, and a servant is singing these songs, or there's a servant in the songs, and he's God's servant. It is the Emmanuel figure that we saw earlier in here. And so Jesus is the true Son of God because he obeys God perfectly. And so it's this point where the Son of God, the true Son of God, Jesus, who doesn't abandon God in the desert, then fulfills the role of being servant at the same time. So let's keep going. The feeding of the thousands, we mentioned that earlier in the class also. Suzette mentioned that. And this is the sixth theme here that Matthew shows us. We have two different feedings, one of 5,000 and one of 4,000. And this is Matthew chapter 14. Yep. 14 and 15. And these episodes are sort of have an obvious connection to to the Exodus and Moses, right? They bring to mind the supplying of manna. We don't know that it was bread in the wilderness. In fact, it says it was like coriander seed and a lot of other things that it's likened to. So we don't know what it actually was or was like. But it brings to mind the manna and being fed. It brings to mind the crossing of the Red Sea, because Jesus is in a boat. He crosses over. And so they contribute to Matthew's emphasis on the identity of who this new Moses character is. So the strength of the Mosaic imagery here lies not in any sort of specific language, like he doesn't quote from the Torah, but the parallels are they're entirely built around the nature of the miracle itself, right? And so the supernatural appearance of bread, the miracle of manna, right? It was called bread from heaven, right? Exodus 16. And that was forever carved into their identity, their being, that God gave us manna to support us in the most difficult of situations. Jesus is giving us manna in this difficult situation. So it's clear here from John's gospel here in John chapter 6 of the feeding that when the multitude saw the miraculous generation or the miraculous supernatural appearance here of the bread, they immediately connected it with Moses' manna miracle. Here, let me just read the slide. I'm kind of stumbling here. When the people saw that the sign had been done, they said, "Indeed, this is the prophet who is to come into the world. Which prophet might that be? I wonder." It's probably the one from Deuteronomy chapter 18. And now, just a couple more slides here. This is the one I wanted to hit the hardest here, and I'll try and make it a little quicker because I've taken so long on the other ones. But the Transfiguration is probably the single account that contains the most imagery of Moses and the Exodus in it. So the Transfiguration occurs on this high mountain, right? And so there should be some things that immediately pop out to us. And I'm just going to list them. I'm just going to go through and sort of give a bullet point list. And we can see that it's obviously connected to Moses because Moses is in the story. And that's one of the things that sticks out the most here. But here we go. The Transfiguration occurs on a high mountain. And you're supposed to be thinking of Sinai. But what is the mountain that the Transfiguration occurs on? And this is something that you kind of have to pick up on contextually. Where is Jesus at this time? This is Matthew 17. Let me just read some of the subheadings of what's going on. So Matthew 17 is the Transfiguration. Matthew 16, though, Jesus is foretelling his death, and there's Peter's confession of Christ. And the Pharisees are testing Jesus, but where is he? He's in Caesarea Philippi. Where is that? Well, I don't have my maps up. Sorry about that. I should have put them up this morning. But Caesarea Philippi is to the northeast. I wonder who took the northern 10 tribes into captivity. That would be Assyria. Where was their empire located? To the northeast. And so when Jesus is transfigured here on the mountain, Mount Hermon, which is in Caesarea Philippi, the imagery here is calling the captive home from exile. We have a contrast between Hermon and Sinai. And this is going to tie us back to Psalm 68. If you want to look at it and read Psalm 68, I would encourage you to do that later. We won't do it right now. Because the mountain there in Psalm 68 is Bashan. And he's calling captives home from this mountain, Bashan, which just happens to be the region that this Mount Hermon is in. And so when Jesus is up on the mountain, the special thing is taking place here. The captives were taken to this region. Psalm 68 says they're going to return from Bashan. Jesus is symbolic of going up on this mountain, a high mountain like Sinai, but he's also calling the captives home. Next, we have a mention of after 6 days, right? In Matthew 17, chapter 1. And 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James, his brother. So we have a numerical connection between Exodus 24, where the glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai for 6 days, right? It's just a numerical connection in this case. But Jesus takes Peter and James and John up to the mountain. Who did Moses take with him but Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu? So he takes 3 people with him. Jesus' face shone like the sun. Moses' face shone like the sun after a trip to Sinai there in Exodus 34. There's a cloud in Matthew chapter 17 and verse 5 that reminds us of the cloud that covered Sinai, the high mountain they went up on in Exodus 24. The voice of God coming out of that cloud reminds us that God spoke to Moses out of the cloud, right, in Exodus 24. God says that, this is number 6, I should have numbered them on the slide, I guess. Number 6, God says that out of the cloud, this is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased, right? That takes us back to Matthew chapter 3 in his baptism when he says the same thing, which again has very obvious new Exodus sort of connections there. And so there's an interconnection within Matthew to Exodus themes. And then lastly, the phrase, listen to him. Here, I have it at the bottom of the slide on Matthew chapter 17 and verse 5. This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. And that positions Jesus as a prophet. We need to listen to the prophet. He is the spokesman for God, like Moses was going to be the mouthpiece of God, it says. Therefore, there's an allusion there to Deuteronomy 18:15, and that's the new prophet who's going to be like Moses. To him you shall listen, it says in 18:15. It's the same verb there, listen, in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, as it is here in Matthew. So he's using the same verb. Listen to him. Listen to Jesus. Listen. Moses says you're going to listen to the prophet. It's the same word that's being used there. So that brings us sort of to the conclusion here, and this is the last one Number 8, the Last Supper, or the Passover that was taking place at that time. And this is towards the end of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26. And this was a Passover celebration, and therefore there is an explicit connection to Exodus and Moses, because that's what the Passover is, right? Let me just read you a quote from commentary that I read. Is D.A. Carson wrote a commentary on Matthew, and he said, "As the bread has just been broken, so Jesus' body will be broken. And just as the people of Israel associated their deliverance from Egypt with eating the Paschal meal, described as divine ordinance, so also the Messiah's people are to associate Jesus' redemptive death with eating this bread by Jesus' authority." So again, we don't have to keep going over all the points here between Jesus and the New Covenant and the Last Supper and the Passover. We just talked about that 20 or 30 minutes ago when we took the Lord's Supper. But it was about reliving the Exodus. In the context of a Passover meal, when Jesus says, "Do this in remembrance of me," means much more than just recalling the past, right? Because Passover not only recalls the events of the Exodus, but the Passover tries to involve every generation that takes part in that experience as a present reality. They are hoping to be led out of exile from the world around them to the ultimate, well, in Isaiah, it's a new Jerusalem, a new heavens and a new earth, right? And so it's a reenactment of what God had done for his people. And in that reenactment, if I can not stumble over my tongue, in that reenactment, the participants are supposed to think of themselves as if they were there, as if it was not just their ancestors, but that they have been slaves, that they have, or that they need to experience the saving power of God. And so that brings us to the close then, because when the gospel writers, especially Matthew, when they begin attaching Jesus to these Hebrew scripture passages, they're saying that this is the person through all these blessings will be accomplished through, that they will be fulfilled through. And so Jesus' sonship, just like Israel had sonship, but Jesus' sonship is superior to Israel's, both because of who he is, right? Israel was God's son by adoption, right? But Jesus was God's son by nature. But Jesus is also superior to Israel because of his functionality, his role, right? Israel was disobedient, but Jesus was perfectly obedient. And so I think if I haven't made it clear, for Matthew, the first son, Israel, just pointed to the last son, Jesus. And so the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, are a component, or are the component in all of these that teaches and reinforces the superiority of Jesus to Moses, of this new prophet to Moses, and his superiority over the Torah. And so that's the context of Matthew teaching Christ to us. It's also the importance, you got to remember, Matthew wrote this to an audience. Matthew didn't write this to us. He wrote it for us, but he didn't write it to us. It's important for Matthew's audience to understand the connections that he's making from Jesus to Moses. Jesus is to be our focus, not the law, not Moses. We're surprised when Jesus taught as one with authority. And so it's a deliberate, it's an intentional contrast between Jesus' victory and Israel's failure in the desert, right? Even under the leadership of the most powerful prophet up until the time of Jesus, they failed. Even that prophet failed, but Jesus would not fail. And so Moses himself failed at the end of his life, if you remember, and Jesus does not. This Son of God, this new Son of God, who was a Son of God before the others were Son of God, and this Moses will succeed. And if you want to be a part of that victory, if you want to be a part of that life-giving force that Jesus is, please come and let us know, and we can help you along that journey. We can help you out of the exodus in your life. We can help you come out of the Egypt of sin and slavery to it, through the waters, into the glorious desert. Christ never promises that life will be easy. I mean, it's not wrong to pray that our life will improve, right? But he never promises that our life is going to be easy. But he does promise that he will sustain us through his word. And if you're ready to make that commitment to be sustained in God through his word, his Son, Jesus Christ, please let us know. You can contact us on Facebook at Sitka Church or on YouTube at Sitka Church. Please let us know. Or if you're here this morning, please let us know, and we can help you do those things. That's the lesson for this morning.